Research Fund. And we've been running a series of seminars for a while now, just basically to get everybody on board on what is that we're doing and advancing some ideas on the interlinkages between climate action and inequalities. So this project is interesting and innovative in a way that we are a bunch of researchers who haven't really worked together that intensely before. And it's a real pleasure to have the PIs of the projects together in one presentation today. So this is, first we'll be speaking Professor Mark New, Pro Vice Chancellor for Climate Change and Director of the ARUA-CD for Climate and Development at UCT. And Murray Leibbrandt will be responding. He is a professor in the School of Economics at UCT, but also the director of SALRU, the South African Labour and Development Research Unit, and the African Centre of Excellence for Inequalities Research, which is the ARUA-CD on inequalities. So these two speakers is what we will have today. So Mark will kick off with a presentation, and then Murray will respond to his presentations, and then you will have to basically hold your questions and thoughts, and then by the end of this we're going to invite for discussion. Looking forward to that. In terms of bandwidth, I think it's always good to see someone, but not necessarily everybody. So this is me for now. My name is Britta Renkamp. I'm a researcher at UCT and research coordinating in this project. So I will keep my camera on only if I'm chairing, when I'm talking as a chair. But I would invite Mark and Murray to put their cameras on while they're talking, and then everyone else who would like to comment or ask a question to please put the camera on, introduce themselves, and ask the question. Cool. So we have an hour roughly, and very much looking forward to this. And yeah, then I would like to invite Mark to kick us off. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody. Britta, and hello everybody. So just checking, number one, you can hear me, and I'm going to share my screen and kick off with the presentation.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, and now I've got to find the right damn screen.
Yeah, now we can also see your screen. Thank you. You could put it on presentation mode if you wanted.
Okay.
Perfect, thanks.
So it should be ready to go now. Okay, I am coming at the issues that we're dealing with in the TSTICA project very much from a climate risk and climate impact point of view, and we are collaborating within the TSTICA project with a bunch of really great people who work on both things like political economy, international relations, as well as the group at ACEIR who work strongly on poverty and inequality research and data collection. So what I'm trying to do, or what I'm going to try and do in this presentation is a couple of things. First of all, this is a bit of a climate risk 101 for the TSTICA team, for people who are not sort of, who haven't been working in this space. And this is really part of the process that we are trying to engage with within the TSTICA project, which is to help sort of build our literacy around the other disciplines that we're interacting with across the project. And then I wanted to sort of follow that up with a bit of a tentative exploration of how poverty and inequality interplay with this idea of climate risk, and maybe finish off a bit with some thoughts about how that could help us think about the framing of climate and poverty and inequality within the TSTICA project, and I guess more generally from a conceptual point of view. So what I'm going to cover is an initial sort of discussion and explanation of how the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that's the IPCC, frames climate risk and the different dimensions of that risk framing around the climate hazard itself, around exposure to the hazard, and around vulnerability to the hazard in the location where people are exposed to the hazard. I'm going to introduce you to some recent advances in thinking about complex risk, and for this I'm drawing very much on a paper that was led by one of our colleagues at ACDI, Nick Simpson, who I see is in the audience. But he's done a really nice piece of work where he's reviewed sort of this IPCC framing and sort of tried to develop this further to be thinking about the complexities of risks that emerge in the real world. Then I wanted to focus in a bit on how poverty and almost by inference inequality acts as a risk modifier. And show some pretty maps that illustrate the rather high sort of climate risk situation, particularly from a vulnerability perspective that we currently sit with in Africa, and then finish off with some sort of thoughts about how we might use this risk framing to conceptualize and integrate climate risk and poverty within the TSTICA project. Okay, so to start off with, the IPCC is very keen on having standardized definitions for different terms. And I think that's quite sensible when you are doing these big assessment reports that span thousands of pages. It can be very easy for individual authors to sort of come up with their own definitions or interpretations of key terms. And that can then lead to a lot of confusing reading for sort of non-experts or even people who are expert in certain areas as you sort of migrate your way through these massive reports, and you get very confused as different terms crop up again, and you can tell that they're being used in slightly different ways, but you're not quite sure who means what, and by the end you're very, very confused. So the IPCC over the years has done a lot of work in developing definitions for commonly used terms within the succession of reports that have been published. And generally each report comes with a glossary that provides these definitions. Some of these definitions have been fairly constant in time, others have evolved over time. But the current definition of risk within the IPCC is sort of multi-sentence, but it's first of all defines what we mean by risk, or what the IPCC understands by risk, and that's the potential for adverse consequences for both human and ecological systems, recognizing that those consequences sort of are framed by a diversity of values and objectives associated with such systems. And the key thing about this definition is the use of the word potential, in the sense that the use of the word risk and with that term potential really means that we're not certain about what the adverse consequences might be, either their nature and or their severity. And that's because the potential for adverse consequences will vary as a number of different factors in a dynamic way as we go from today into the future. And when we look at the climate hazards, again, the potential for the severity of a particular climate hazard even today or the probability of its magnitude will be uncertain. And so we have to bear with sort of the potential for high or low magnitude hazards occurring in any particular location. In the context of climate change, then, the IPCC says that risks can arise from the potential impacts of climate change, as well as the human responses to climate change. And that's quite an important sort of addition when I'm thinking about risk. So in responding to climate change, either with regards to emissions reduction or with regards to adaptation and trying to manage those climate risks, the responses do have the potential to change the risk and potentially increase the risk. Some of the relevant adverse consequences that, that the IPCC includes in its framing of risk include sort of human consequences, so lives, livelihoods, health, well-being, economic and social and cultural assets, investments, infrastructure, services, including ecosystem services, and then also on ecosystems and species themselves. So the consequences really are multi, if you like, the impacts or the potential for adverse consequences that we're talking about span essentially any way that a climate risk can propagate through into individual consequences or coupled consequences within the system. Okay, so the IPCC then sort of tries to, has tried to define a set of determinants of risks, and this is colloquially known as the risk propeller. So risk essentially arises, if we look in this diagram here, risk arises from the intersection of three dimensions of risk. Hazards, exposure, and vulnerability. The hazards are largely driven, when we're talking about climatic hazards at least, they're driven by a consequence of pre-existing natural variability in the climate. So we've always had droughts, for instance, and droughts are a very important climatic hazard in many contexts, especially Africa. But then anthropogenic climate change essentially is superimposing itself on this natural variability to change the risk, or sorry, the likelihood and potential intensity and frequency of these climatic hazards that contribute to climate risk. Exposure essentially covers who's in the path of these hazards, of the hazard. So that's who or what is in the path. And vulnerability is essentially covers the degree to which whoever is in the path of that hazard is going to be badly affected by that hazard. I'll dig into those in a little bit more detail in the next few sections to explain how those play out. But I guess the important thing here is that the exposure and vulnerability are largely, particularly with regards to human systems, largely defined by socioeconomic processes. So both sort of issues around governance, socioeconomic situation, and as well as particular climate change response action. So a whole spectrum of socioeconomic and political economic factors influence vulnerability and exposure. So if we just break this down into, I'm just going to dig in a little bit more detail into some of these different dimensions. So in terms of the climatic hazards that we're interested, that we might want to be concerned about, the IPCC defines a hazard as a natural or human-induced physical event or a trend. So by a trend we mean a gradual change in some state or metric of the climate that may cause adverse consequences. And here they're talking about loss of life, injury, or other health impacts, as well as damage and loss to property, infrastructure, services, ecosystems, and environmental resources. So it's essentially some kind of event or trend that produces these negative impacts. And it's quite useful to think of common climate and weather hazards in terms of direct and what I've called kind of indirect or hazards. So direct hazards would be where it's actually the meteorological or climatological event that's actually causing the injury, loss of life, etc. So examples of those might be a drought, a meteorological drought, hail, heavy rain causing, say, crop damage, wind blowing over houses or causing infrastructure damage, heat waves occurring either sort of atmospheric heat waves causing land surface heating, and that could, for instance, cause direct damage to tarmac and road infrastructure, or marine heat waves that can have quite strong ecological impacts on, for instance, through coral reef bleaching. Sea level rise, storm surges, saltwater intrusion due to sea level rise in coastal areas, and sort of an indirect effect of greenhouse gas emissions, ocean acidification. So all of those sort of occur sort of a direct response in the climate system, if you like. But then there's a range of hazards and perils that are influenced by climate variables as well. So those include wildfire, pest swarms, river flooding, vector-borne diseases, avalanches and landslides, coastal erosion, groundwater recharge, and eventually perhaps groundwater shortages. So to give the example of wildfire, people often talk about fire weather conditions. So in addition to wildfire risk being a function of sort of landscape management and how well sort of fire risk reduction processes are taking place, either through managing the fuel load, making sure that sort of property at risk is not too deeply embedded in a fire-prone landscape, etc. The risk of wildfire is also a function of a number of climate variables. So, for example, if wildfire risk increases if you have a dry period, sort of a prolonged dry period, because that essentially dries out the fuel load and makes it more combustible. But it also can increase if you've had a number of wet years in the previous years, because then you've had above average plant growth, and the fuel load as you move into this dry period has been has built up a bit more due to the increased plant production. Then other factors affecting wildfire risk include wind speed, temperature, which increases the temperature of the fuel load and its flammability, as well as humidity. So if you have dry conditions in the lead up to a fire ignition event, for instance, then that enhances the drying and therefore the flammability of the fuel load. So these sort of indirect climate and weather related hazards can have a combination of meteorological or climatic causes, where climate processes are a contributing factor in that particular hazard severity and occurrence. There's been quite a lot of increasing recognition, particularly in this current cycle of the IPCC process, of this idea of compound or multi-hazards. These are sort of discrete or hazards that might occur closely together or together in time and or space. So examples of that kind of compound hazard might be that you have a drought event that leads to overgrazing, followed by a heavy rainfall event. And because you've had overgrazing and land degradation, that increases the propensity for flooding and erosion. And so you can actually have the drought event creating pre-existing conditions that increase the severity of the flood-inducing rain event, for instance. Or you, within a given drought, you could have a combination of hazards occurring. So in addition to reduced water availability, you could have heat stress occurring. So you've got two hazards sort of emerging from the same meteorological event. And the key thing about some of these compound or multi-hazards is that often the impacts are sort of multiplicative rather than additive or cumulative. So the impacts or the adverse consequences of compound hazards can often be more than the sum of the individual impacts if they were occurring in an isolated manner. Okay, moving on to exposure. So the definition of exposure from the IPCC is that talks about the presence of people, livelihood, species, etc. All the things that we're worried about getting damaged in places and settings that could be adversely affected, in this case, by the climate hazard. So it's really about location. For a given hazard, are there people or assets, etc., who are in the path of where these potential hazards might occur? So examples of sort of exposed locations or exposure that are quite commonly talked about from the perspective of climate risk would be low-lying coastal areas as one example, where there are a number of hazards that people and assets might be exposed to. Sea level rise being a trend, a gradual change, coastal erosion, the possibility of storm surges and flooding during extreme weather events, marine heating and damage to the coastal environment through acidification, which then also reduces the resilience of the coastal system to some of these other hazards. A second example, which is quite relevant to Africa, where we have large semi-arid regions. I mean, most of Southern Africa, apart from the east coast and the south coast of the subcontinent, is arid to semi-arid. Here, there's high exposure to drought, heat stress, and paradoxically flooding, because some of the rare events, rainfall events that we do have can be quite intense, and the nature of the natural environment with sort of low vegetation cover means that there's a high propensity to produce overland flooding when you do have a heavy rainfall event. Another particular sort of location of high exposure are urban areas. And we obviously get urban areas occurring in many different settings, but one reason that they are important from an exposure point of view is they're sort of locations of concentrated exposure. We have many people, a large number of physical assets, and a lot of economic assets and critical sort of infrastructure co-located. So for any particular hazard, if it hits an urban area, the consequences are likely to be much more severe than in a non-urban area, where the assets and people tend to be more sort of distributed in space. So a big focus in I guess in climate risk management, especially in this current round of the IPCC assessment, is focusing on urban areas because of this sort of concentrated risk and exposure that we see in these settings. Okay, moving on to this third sort of arm of the IPCC risk propeller, is this concept of vulnerability. And the way the IPCC defines vulnerability is as the propensity or predisposition to be adversely affected by a given hazard in a given location. And the IPCC goes on to sort of to mention or discuss that vulnerability encompasses a variety of concepts and elements, but the critical two they focus here are on the sensitivity or susceptibility to harm. So that's really sort of a definition of the current level of adaptation. So given the state of the system, how sensitive is that system or person or crop or ecosystem to a particular intensity of hazard. And then the second component really talks about the ability to respond, or the capacity to recover and adapt. And that's really talking about the resilience of the system. So when an impact happens, how quickly and how easily can that entity, if you like, respond, and also the adaptive capacity, the ability to improve or to reduce sensitivity and susceptibility in the face of future risks. So here's an example of sort of the same the same hazard, which is around coastal erosion and sea level rise. The same sort of, if you like, setting in terms of exposure, which is a low-lying coastal area. And here we have an example with relatively low vulnerability from the Netherlands, where there's a whole set of vulnerability reduction processes that have been put in place here. You'll see that there's where my mouse is hovering now is actually an embankment protecting the low-lying areas on the inside from storm surges and flooding events. And then along the coast is a set of other interventions to prevent coastal erosion. So these groins that are sort of going out into the sea are aimed to break up waves and longshore transport and erosion. And you don't see it here, but also there is coastal sediment replenishment, so that when there is erosion and loss of the sediment, protecting sort of the outer edges of this coastal protection system, they actually can import new sediment and replenish the soft sort of outside coastal coastal defenses. If we move to an example that I particularly enjoy, it's from a sister project in one of our previous projects under the Korea program, Collaborative Adaptation Research in Africa and Asia. This is a drone footage of a village, a fishing village situated on the Volta River Delta in Ghana. And about 20 years ago, this village was sitting quite well inland from the shoreline, but because of a combination of sea level rise and reduced sediment flow into the delta because of the construction of the Volta Dam several decades ago, there's been a retreat and erosion of the delta, and this village is now situated literally in the tidal zone. So this drone footage, which I'm now going to play, shows exactly what's happening to this village, where there is no coastal protection. There's been no sort of work to try and replenish the sediment supply, and there's, if one could argue that some kind of hard protection was possible, it might hold back the seas. But here you can see that there's a very different level of vulnerability to this coastal settlement in the Ghanaian example compared to the example from the Netherlands. Okay, I just wanted to talk briefly also about this idea of response risk. So within sort of the exposure and vulnerability setting, there are certain responses that could be made, and those may or may not change the overall risk setting. Essentially, we have to sort of be aware that some of these responses can either increase in situ risk or actually transfer risk as well. The key response to reducing the hazard is really mitigation or emissions reduction. And apart from a few maybe minor cases, it's really the only way to avoid or to reduce the sort of increase in the severity of the hazard. But some of those mitigation options actually can induce other risks. And two of the main ones that have sort of been highlighted are efforts for mitigation that include the use of biofuels or land-based carbon dioxide removal. And the ways that these can change sort of overall risk arise because of the way that biofuels or some carbon dioxide removal mechanisms can compete with land for food, and also compete with or alter water availability for other uses. So we know that, for instance, in semi-arid to subhumid areas, where rainfall is of the order of 400 to about 800 millimeters, afforestation, which can have a very strong carbon dioxide reduction impact, can really critically affect surface water availability, because it's that sort of rainfall band of 400 to 800 millimeters a day, where small changes in the hydrological water balance can produce very large changes in surface water runoff and in groundwater recharge. Obviously, hydropower, which can be implemented as a so-called renewable form of energy, can have very strong downstream effects on water, on both human water users as well as ecology. And we only need to look at the Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia to show some of the concerns that Sudan and Egypt have about what the building of a large hydropower dam that is also going to offtake irrigation water for local use might have for water security in a downstream situation. Obviously, there are ways that adaptation can also increase exposure and vulnerability. It can increase the risk overall. So although adaptation is generally aimed to reduce exposure and vulnerability, it can have sort of adverse consequences. And I'll be talking about that in a bit more detail when we talk a little bit more about poverty and inequality later on. But a really nice example of how adaptation to reduce flood risk can actually increase flood risk as well. Comes from the example of the Kosi River in Bihar in India. So the Kosi River is one of the major tributaries to the Ganges that drains out of the Nepalese part of the Himalaya, and in the lowlands, in the sort of the floodplain of the Ganges River, where the Kosi joins the Ganges River, there's been a lot of work in building flood protection levees or barriers to protect farming communities around there from sort of run-of-the-mill type floods. So generally what happens in this sort of setting, once every 2 years, there's a high flow event that produces localized flooding, and the building of flood barriers can protect farms and property from that. But then there was kind of a flood of the century that came down in 2008, and through a various range of consequences and factors, the floodplain barriers were breached, and there was widespread flooding over hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. And what had actually happened is that people had felt a false sense of security, and there'd been extensive development right in the areas next to where that was so-called protected, and it led to basically a very high exposure to extreme floods, low exposure, if you like, or low vulnerability to low floods, to sort of average floods because of the protection. But once the protection was breached, then the damages were enormous. So this shows an example here of where there's settlements to the right of the flood barrier, where the river channel is to the left. And the moment all these people thought they were safe because they were behind the flood barrier, but the moment it was breached, then there was enormous damage and loss of life and impacts on livelihoods. Okay, I just want to quickly drill into some of the emerging thinking about complex risk, and I do want to point you to this paper that's just been published by Nick Simpson and many other collaborating authors, which really is a very nice starts with a nice review of the evolution of the way risk has been framed within the IPCC process, but then also looks at the way risk has been framed from a climate perspective in other settings, and how we need to be thinking about climate risk in a much more complex and nuanced manner than the rather simple three-arm propeller of the IPCC. The great advantage of the IPCC framing is that it's a very clear way to communicate to the non-expert. You know, you can say, well, there are three things you need to do. You need to worry about the hazard, you need to worry about exposure, and you need to worry about vulnerability. So that's where you need to invest in terms of managing climate risk. But what it doesn't do is sort of go several levels down into teasing out some of the complexities in that rather simplistic description. So so in this paper, Nick explored a number of different ways in which risk is more complex often than that rather simple representation. And the two of the major ways that risk is more complex is that we often have a number of interacting factors that are affecting climate risk itself. So Nick gives a nice example here where he develops the IPCC risk propeller. He adds a fourth blade to that, which is essentially around how responses can to perceived or actual climate risk can also interact to produce a change in risk, and how then different hazards, different dimensions or subsets or factors relating to exposure and different factors relating to vulnerability can all interact in quite complex ways, both within each of these kind of propeller arms, but also between the propeller arms to produce very sort of diverse potential integrated risk outcomes, if you like. So he gives a couple of different examples around that. One of them being, this one being around the heat wave in Europe a couple of years ago. He has a nice example based on the Cape Town drought that many of us here in Cape Town were part of, and a couple of other examples as well. And then the other thing he talks about is how these risks interact with other non-climatic risks. And I think we have to recognize that we live in a sort of a multi-risk setting where there are multiple drivers of different types of risks that are interacting. And a really nice example that was used in this paper that came from an experience of one of my IPCC colleagues who were doing disaster risk reduction work with the Red Cross in Bangladesh was during the COVID crisis last year, a lot of the low-lying areas in Bangladesh were suddenly seriously affected by flooding as there was an extreme rainfall event. I think it was one of the tropical cyclones that made landfall in the Bay of Bengal. But essentially, they had this this real issue. The standard reaction to flood risk is for people to evacuate their homes and go to high-lying areas where there are sort of evacuation shelters. But because of COVID, that was putting people into sort of situations that were violating the advice they were giving regarding social distancing. So you're taking distributed households and concentrating them in a single location. And so there you can see how different types of risk and risk management strategies can actually interact to produce quite complex risk outcomes when these things sort of coincide in time and space. So just in summary here, I think there is recognition and people are trying to grapple with this in the risk management setting that, most risk settings involve multiple interacting factors, that these are often climatic and non-climatic, and that also that responding to climate risk might either compete or be synergistic with other real world decisions that are being made. And that we should always bear in mind that what looks like a rational risk management decision may actually not be rational from another perspective, whether one's thinking of it from a political or an economic or some other sort of factor that is affecting a decision-making and management process. Great. So just quickly to finish off, I wanted to sort of focus in now a little bit on Africa. I wanted to, first of all, illustrate or use two maps to illustrate why this linkage between, or why Africa is a really important place to be thinking about climate risk. And the first of these maps come from an initiative called ND GAIN, which ND stands for Notre Dame, the University of Notre Dame, and GAIN, G-A-I-N, stands for the Global Adaptation Index. And at the national scale, they continually, on an annual basis, sort of map the essentially the vulnerability and readiness of countries to respond to climate change through adaptation. And as you can see from this map, when we look at vulnerability to climate risk, so essentially their definition of vulnerability is a little bit different to the IPCC's. It involves issues of both vulnerability in the IPCC sense, but also exposure and the types of hazards that occur in a country. But you'll see that many African countries are very high on the vulnerability scale. So all of the orange and red countries are countries that are particularly vulnerable relative to other countries in the globe. And then if we look at their readiness index, there's quite a similar pattern. So readiness really talks about the adaptive capacity or the ability to respond to the emerging climate risks. And again, most countries in Africa are in the sort of bottom quartile of the distribution of readiness. So if we then think about what that means in an African context, those issues of climate risk, and particularly the ones we can do anything about in terms of exposure and vulnerability and ability to respond, are particularly tough, if you like, compared to many other countries. So there's the risk setting is a challenging one in many of these countries. So moving on to thinking about the interactions between climate risk, poverty, and inequality, I wanted to start off by saying I think it's fair to say that poverty and inequality can both be a determinant and an outcome of climate risk. And so and I think this is one of the things that the TSTICA project is really trying to explore, is how poverty and inequality both determine the way that people are vulnerable, but also the types of responses that happen, and whether those responses then do actually sort of exacerbate or act to reduce poverty and inequality. So what I'm going to do quickly is just look at how poverty and inequality play out again in those three different dimensions of climate risk, starting off with climate hazards. And as I said earlier, emissions cuts are really the only routes to reducing climate hazards. So what do emission reductions really mean in terms of the relationship with poverty and inequality? Well, I think the first thing here, and there are people in the meeting who can talk about this far better than me, but action on mitigation has really been dominated by developed country agendas and sort of imbalances of power. And the voices of the most vulnerable, who are often really either poor countries or poor people in poor countries, are really only heard from a moral perspective, in terms of the moral argument of the rich countries have a duty and a responsibility to address mitigation because of the impacts. But that's quite a weak position to be in defining what the priorities and actions should be in the emissions reduction space. The other important thing to note is that most of the greenhouse gas consumption is by the most wealthy. So about 10% of the richest in the world consume about half of the carbon, and half of the poorest half of the world, 3.5 billion poorest people, consume only 10%. So there's little incentive for rich people to act on mitigation, as they are the least vulnerable. And that's certainly historically been the case. I guess some of the extinction revolution work in the middle classes is starting to change that perception a little bit, but certainly a lot of the inaction on mitigation has been because the richest of the rich are actually pretty resilient to some of the impacts, or at least perceive that they're resilient to the impacts of climate change. Some of the other aspects that affect poverty and climate change are that mitigation efforts can probably affect low-skilled and subsistence workers. So we know all about the just transition debate for South Africa in terms of moving out of coal and what happens to unskilled workers and low-skilled workers there. Similarly, in other African countries, stopping charcoal production and artisanal coal mining might also have negative impacts on poorer people in those countries, and also many workers who are poorly paid are working in industries that are particularly vulnerable to changes resulting from action on mitigation. And then finally, there's been a sort of a growing talk about leaving fossil fuels in the ground in developing countries. So Ecuador was one of the first countries about 10 years ago to suggest to the international community that a new oil field that had been found, they were happy to not exploit it, provided that there was compensation for not exploiting it. And the challenge here is that assuming that that the good governance and good financial management, the revenues that accrue from exploitation of fossil fuels in developing countries can actually be a big stimulus to economic development generally. So an example would be the gas field that Total has now abandoned off Mozambique, but the estimated value of that gas field is several $100 billion, and depending on the tax calculations on the revenue from that accounts to several $billion potentially a year in terms of tax revenue for the Mozambique government that could really be used to invest in development in other sectors. So that is also a potential link to poverty in terms of the opportunity cost of not exploiting those fossil fuels that are in the ground while there's still a market for such fuels. So in terms of poverty and exposure, many poor people live and work in more exposed situations. Some quick examples of that are urban poor, often living in exposed areas where there's a higher risk of flooding, there's a higher fire risk. They're living on hillsides like the favelas of Rio de Janeiro, which are highly exposed to landslides, etc. And many poor people work in labor situations where heat stress and other climate-related health risks are more likely. Pastoralists depend on rangeland for biomass and water, often in drought-prone areas. And many rural communities actually depend on local natural resources. So their livelihoods are not very geographically diversified. And these natural resources based rural livelihoods are often in more marginal climatic settings. So many of the poorest people are sitting in some of the most exposed settings, if you like. And then in terms of poverty and vulnerability, sensitivity to these hazards in different locations is very often higher amongst poorer people. So for example, in urban areas, poorer communities often have poorer quality housing, which makes them more susceptible to climatic hazards such as heat stress, wind damage, fire living in dense communities, increasing fire risk, poor drainage leading to flooding and sanitation issues and health impacts. Poorer farmers often are farming on less productive land, have lower yields, have fewer agricultural inputs, have less financial capital to withstand bad years from a climatic perspective. And many of the sort of development economists will be familiar with the idea of poverty traps, where because of those lack of assets, then you can end up in a downward spiral where you're badly affected in a drought year. You have to sell assets to essentially survive, and it takes a long time to recover and build up those assets. And just as they're starting to recover, another drought comes along and knocks you back again. So you get sort of trapped in this vicious cycle where you're continually being knocked back by climatic hazards and finding it difficult to escape from a poverty trap. And secondly, adaptive capacity is often lower amongst poorer communities. There's an interesting review that's just recently been done on the way that adaptive capacity has been framed, and many of the commonly used dimensions for adaptive capacity actually align quite well with the dimensions commonly used when thinking about multidimensional poverty and inequality. So just one example here, this is for adaptive capacity of sort of small farmers in the Philippines, but the dimensions of adaptive capacity assessed or identified with those small farmers include human resources, which include sort of things like experience of farming and education levels and sort of years of education and sort of level of education, physical resources, such as farm size and number of farm machines owned, etc. Financial resources, which includes general sort of financial assets as well as access to other financial resources, informational resources, and also livelihood diversity. So, and you can see that many of those sort of relate to some of the capacities, either the livelihood capacities that we often talk about in livelihoods talk, or many of the dimensions around multidimensional poverty and multidimensional inequality. So these, so there seems to be, to me, to be a strong link between, therefore, multidimensional poverty and adaptive capacity and ability to respond and adapt to these, to reduce vulnerability. Okay, so just quickly to finish off, I was thinking about one way of how we might use this risk framing to think about the links between climate risk and poverty. And I've taken the liberty of taking one of Nick's examples. And here, this is the example he gave about these interacting risks. And instead of having risk to infrastructure at the center of the risk we're particularly interested in here, within TSTICA, we're interested in risk to poverty and inequality reduction, or I guess progress on reducing poverty and inequality. And we could be thinking about how the sort of different actions that are happening in the climate change space and how they interact with other related actions in other decision spaces and other sort of dimensions of society, all interact potentially to either increase or reduce the risk of our ability, and our being could be anybody, a village in a country, a city or a state, to progress on those two critical sustainable development goals of reducing poverty and reducing inequality. And I think we could usefully be thinking about sort of framing some of these drivers and interactions in this kind of way to understand how the different sort of dimensions of action that we're looking at and factors that we look at sort of play out in this inequality and poverty risk space. So I realize I've talked a heck of a long time, and I want to apologize for that. I thought it was going to be much quicker, but I will stop now and hand over to Murray to perhaps give a quick response, or as long as you want, Murray, basically, I guess.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark. While Murray is getting ready, I'd just like to invite people who are attending. If you have questions, you're also welcome to type them in the chat. Murray, are you ready?
Yes, but how long do we have people
Okay,
with us
welcome.
for? Britta?
Yes?
How long do we have people with us for?
Well, we initially had aimed for the end of the hour, but we can do until 2:30, so you can just comment.
Okay, I really don't want to crowd out other input. I'll get plenty of opportunity to come in. So let me just make some quick points, and let me just start with that diagram that Mark had up at the end, which is a useful framework, and it is opening up the standard climate risk, climate change thinking around poverty and inequality, but it's just a diagram at the end of the day. Nonetheless, you do see big models of the impact that that climate change is going to have on poverty and inequality, or and what sort of these models are being run, and one wonders what's going on under the bonnet, in a sense, because the diagram is a useful framework, but I think that one of the sort of founding principles, in a sense, of the TSTICA project is the recognition of the fact that if you start with poverty and inequality, they are generated in quite complex ways and in context-specific ways, and some cognizance needs to be given to that. And let me just make a few points. So on the one hand, there's the necessity, the absolute necessity, really, to put on the table in each country context for these discussions the static picture of what the situation actually is in the country, or a static picture, even if you like. I keep emphasizing static. I think there's huge limitations to that. But if you think about across space, how do livelihoods work? What is the, what are people doing to live in rural area, in rural Ghana versus rural South Africa versus rural Kenya versus urban, etc. What are the class, let's look at the land that people are using. Let's look at their access to energy. Let's look at the access to water. But also we have to augment that with a picture of their livelihoods, of transport, how they get to work, but what sort of employment they're doing. And so in our project, we think about that in terms of consolidating around a spatial picture in each country context. But crucial to the picture, the statistics don't speak for themselves. So you've got to put together the livelihoods across the distribution. You've got to get a sense of how different, as we've heard repeatedly from Mark, the poor are hugely vulnerable at all points of this, of climate change, of mitigation policies that are made with no regard to how their livelihoods actually work. So that's the one thing, really understanding, I guess that's my point, really understanding how poverty and inequality look and are working as a bundle of assets, but also a bundle of opportunities is crucial. So, but it's also super limited in the sense that that enables people to do the type of exercises that they do, where they take that cross-sectional picture and give it some nuance about what are the implications going to be of a certain carbon tax policy in South Africa through energy prices, through access to energy, etc. It's quite useful, but it's also not very useful if you're really interested in the impacts of climate change and mitigation policies on poverty and inequality. You are going to have to understand, we are going to have to understand how the dynamics, how livelihoods actually happen across the distribution in each country context. So for example, the same cluster of multi-dimensional assets and vulnerabilities and things can mean very, very different things in urban South Africa to urban Ghana to any different context, because they get put together in different livelihoods, completely different. So the actual consequences, the static picture will not really tell you the story. And so Mark mentioned poverty traps, and that's the step in the right direction, that actually we do need to connect these, the climate change and the discussions of resilience, etc. in general, with how that really works at the local level. And that requires, that then does require an analysis of the dynamics of that sustained poverty and the role of land and water and energy in that, and the role, for example, of if you raise the price of energy through some sort of carbon tax, what is it actually going to do in different contexts? Okay, so let me just stop there so that we can have some other discussion. But it's really just to validate the key point that there is a necessity, a pressing necessity, to come in and really understand. So Mark was talking about these the just transition and coal and stuff. We really do need to understand the impacts of that in our context, and that's not the same issue that confronts people elsewhere necessarily. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Murray. Are there any questions? I saw there was an exchange in the chat from Harold. Harold, did you want to pose your question, or had Mark answered already? I guess Harold's not there anymore. Any other questions? I have one otherwise. Mark, thanks a lot for the presentation, and Murray, thanks for the response. I'm always stunned by the lack of conceptualization of political risk, actually, right, in the IPCC and elsewhere. There is, on that Propeller, there's one side of it called governance, but that is about it. And given that the inequalities, as much as climate action, requires so much political effort, I think conceptually it's really still like very limited area, and political risk as such then comes in finance, in the finance literature, but there's still quite a big gap. But I see hands are coming up. Tracy, would you like to come on?
Hi, thanks very much. My name's Tracy Davies from Just Share, which is a shareholder activist organization. Thanks for the incredibly helpful and clear presentation, Mark. I just wanted to ask, in the context of this project, how much focus there will be, if any, on the private sector and its impacts and contribution to climate change and climate action, or will it be focused more strongly on kind of policy and the policy and regulatory space? I mean, not that they don't intersect, but just the extent to which you will be factoring private sector actors into this work.
Thanks, Tracy. Mark, if you want to respond, and then we'll go to Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks, Tracy. Good question there. I don't think, I mean, project itself is set up in a way that really starts with the priorities that have been defined nationally. So those priorities in terms of action might well involve the private sector, but I don't think that the focus will be specifically driven by this recognition of the private sector. It's probably more important than a lot of people think. So, so the private sector would be one of the ways within which one might expect climate action to happen, and we're having to pick and choose a little bit carefully what we focus on in terms of particular climate actions, both in the mitigation and the adaptation space. So I can't really answer you fully at this stage because we haven't got to the stage of identifying specific actions in both the emissions reduction and the kind of and the sort of hazard risk management space or adaptation space. But many of them could involve looking at the role of the private sector, or at least private actors.
Thanks, Mark. And sorry, just to clarify that I'm also obviously not just speaking about the climate element of that, but also the poverty and inequality element, and the extent to which the private sector, particularly the kind of multinational corporate listed space in this country, has not necessarily has contributed to the exacerbation of poverty and inequality in some respects. So just also a multidimensional private sector approach just to think about at some point. It'd maybe be good to have a chat about that separately.
Great, thanks. Yeah.
Murray, did you have anything to add to that question?
No, nothing useful. Just to say it is a very good question, and the role of obviously the way it's not just policy, it's not just about government, and it's how the economy works exactly. And so that was a very useful input, and understanding that very clearly. How we got to the present, I guess that was my key point. You've got to, these static snapshots don't speak for themselves, and a certain private sector monopoly behaving in a certain way is a very different situation going forward to a different type of energy supply thing, even if they're all using the same amount of coal. It's not the same thing. Thanks.
Thanks, Tracy. I hope that answers your question. Thanks, Murray, for the response. Jonathan, would you like to go next?
Sure. Thanks. Thanks for an amazing talk, gents, and all involved. It's Jonathan from Soldru. I just want to share a quick thought, and it really speaks to a matter that's quite close to heart, and that's the acquisition and the gathering of sort of primary data, primary resource data. As a soil scientist, it's become really clear that there is a clear lack of, in South Africa at a national level, in fact, of this acquisition of raw data, so that we can actually make, whether it's bioclimatic, bioresource, anything related to degradation, anything related to soil organic carbon. I mean, we're yet to have a unified soil organic carbon map for South Africa, let alone at a provincial or at an even municipal level. So, I think initiatives that focus on vulnerability and risk and exposure are very difficult to contextualize, in the absence of this sort of really high quality data. And unfortunately, again, as a soil scientist, you have to get your hands dirty, literally. I'm reminded of a saying that I heard very many years back, where it says, it goes something along the lines of, you're asking me how a watch works, when in fact, all we're doing is focusing on the time. And I think that sort of, for me, sums up that there's a lot that we could be doing, and we could be gathering in terms of the raw data to make better informed decisions and arrive at better or well-rounded indices. And again, I think we need to maybe focus on that as well as a policy and the implementation side. So yeah, just a bit of a thought, really.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jonathan, for sharing this thoughts. Are there any comments, responses, reactions, Mark and Murray, or anybody else?
I mean, I agree that totally that the more data you have, the better evidence you can have. But I also think we have to be realistic and realize that we're often going to be in a data constrained situation, and we have to think about how we can plan and respond in situations where there is imperfect data. So even if you had the best information on soil carbon, we've got a wide range of projections of what climate change is going to do, and how that might then impact on the ability on soil carbon and net primary productivity and sort of biogeochemical processes. And so your decisions about what you're going to do, if you are thinking about some form of intervention that enhances soil carbon storage, for instance, is necessarily going to have to be taken under conditions of uncertainty. So I agree that the better the data you have, the better your decisions can be, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't be making decisions with the available data when we have a really, really urgent situation that we have to deal with. The time for waiting, in many cases, the time for waiting for good enough data is probably over. We have to be, and you economists are pretty damn good at making forecasts based on bad data and always being proved wrong. So I don't think it should be an excuse for not acting.
Can I come in there and maybe pull Shona into the discussion, because it seems to me, though, that there is some sort of obligation to at least play through what you're saying and proposing through some, okay, let's take a stylized household, or take a different, set across the distribution and think this thing through. What are we saying? How's it actually going to work? And one can use qualitative data, one can use whatever, but one has to think through. Either way, you are thinking through a livelihood outcome. So best you try and do that with the best information that you have. Maybe Shona can come in on that.
Sorry, I actually missed the original question, Murray.
It was just about the fact that we have to make some policy responses to climate change. It's pressing, and so we've got to use whatever data we've got, right?
Yes.
And do the best we can. And I was just saying, you need to bring a livelihoods perspective as well with the best that you've got.
Yes, so definitely. And there are some people that have been able to do that, but I still think there's quite a lot of gaps in the data that we have. And, over time, and maybe, this would be an outcome I think would be really valuable from this project, is if we can engage with those involved in, the national statistics and say, if we're actually going to be able to get a good sense of the impacts of climate change on people on the ground, these are some other potential variables that could be built into existing national surveys. So I do think, part of what we could be doing in this project is trying to recognize where those gaps are. And, what further data might we need to really understand and be able to assess over time the impacts of climate change on local livelihoods. Yeah, and I mean, the other area I've always wanted to do, and I've never quite managed it successfully, is, there's long-term data sources in places, site-specific areas around, health, around ecological services, around, changes in the marine environment, etc. But we don't have any long-term place-based surveys around, livelihoods and changes in livelihoods with changes in the environment. So again, I do feel if there's a way, if there was a possibility for that, would be really great. You could look at, different parts of the country and have some sites that you're actually monitoring livelihoods over a very long time period in alongside the changes that are occurring in climate and, other factors in people's local spaces and their landscapes, in policies, etc. Yeah, so the best do what we can with what we have, but I think there are gaps, and maybe it's something we need to be working on, is identifying those gaps and look for ways to fill them. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Shona. I think that's a very valuable point. I think we need to work with what we have, but also keep working and improving the situation. And I attended a webinar the other day with Martin Wittenberg, who also tried to gather the data that we do on the various SDGs that we have and that we are working with, so that we also, make more of what we have actually. Sorry, there was another question in the chat. Ivan, did you want to post that question?
Thanks very much. No, not really. I was just dipping in and out, so I haven't actually been able to follow the webinar very consistently. It was in response really to a previous comment about the private sector. And it struck me that, you hear more and more about the ESG issues, environmental, social, and governance issues affecting private investment decisions, and how much more seriously, apparently, these issues are now being taken. And I just wondered whether that might give some scope for introducing issues of risk and vulnerability and so on, and getting the private sector more thoroughly engaged. Apologies, as I say, I haven't been following much of the webinar because of other commitments.
Great, thanks for the question. There will be a recording in any event. But Mark, you responded in the chat, but did you want to talk a bit more about it?
Not really. I think somebody like Tracy could probably do a much better job than me, but I didn't know what issues Ivan was talking about, but certainly the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure has gone way beyond just sort of carbon-related issues to including a sort of a stand, not, I don't know about standard, but sort of a requirement that, or recommendation that companies, the private sector, assesses what they call physical risk, which is sort of the impacts essentially on them, and actually up and down their supply and distribution chain perhaps as well. And also then think about, also start to articulate what their adaptation essentially responses would be to those identified risks. I think it's still quite new, so not many companies have got further than at least recognizing what the risks are, kind of doing the risk assessment, if you like. I think there are some that are now sort of starting to really get serious about what their risk reduction responses, physical risk reduction or adaptation responses would be. But those guys are sort of ahead of the game compared to the average corporation, I would guess. But Tracy can probably give a much more intelligent answer.
I think it was a good start. Tracy, did you want to come into that?
Yeah, not more intelligent, I don't think, but yeah, I agree. It is a kind of exploding area, and I would say though that at present we're still very much in the disclosure phase rather than the integration phase and the strategic alignment phase or the capital allocation phase. So there's a lot of talk about these issues, but in terms of actually changing fundamental business practices, not nearly enough action, which is where kind of shareholder, the shareholder activist movement thinks about these things, is how to make this, how to action all of these commitments and disclosures. But at the moment, it's certainly not yet robust enough to make, nearly the kind of contribution that we needed to make to, for example, achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement.
All right, thank you very much for that, Tracy. Ivan, I hope that answered your question. Are there any other questions? Anyone else? Okay, if that's not the case, then I would like to thank you all. Thanks for all these insights. Thanks for the 25-minute talk, Mark. And thanks for the responses and all the insightful comments. We'll have a 10-minute follow-up with the team. So if everyone else who's not in the core team of TSTICA can just remove themselves from the call, and we can just have a quick catch up internally. But thank you very much for joining us, and yeah, keep watching the space. There will be webinars every month, sometimes more often. And we also have our website up and running with updates on the work that we're doing on this important topic.